Every HTML element has a frame around it. It is just not visible by default. In order to see that, I have prepared an example document. It consists of an h1 heading, a p tag, and an unordered list with some entries. Furthermore, there is a link tag to include a style.css file. This style.css file is currently empty, and we will write our style information into it. In the browser, our site looks like this. Here we can see our heading, the paragraph, and the unordered list. None of the elements has a visible frame, since this is the default behavior of the browser. To change that, we can use the border style property, as it defines the kind of border that the elements should have. To do so, it can accept a variety of different keywords as value. Let's try that with our h1 heading, and therefore write h1 as selector in our CSS file. Inside the curly braces, we now need to set border style for the name of the property that we want to change. The default value for this property is none, which tells the browser to not create a visible border for the element. To change that, we can instead set solid for the value to get straight lines. Let's now save that and open the HTML file in the browser. And indeed, our h1 element now has a solid border. This border always surrounds the entire element. Since the h1 tag is a block level element that always takes the entire available width for itself, the border does not end at the end of the text, but reaches all the way over here to the right end of the site. Just like that, we can also make the borders of our p tag and the unordered list visible. Since we want them to use the same style information as the h1 element, we can simply put the names of all the tags in a group selector, save the file, and return to the browser. Here we can see that our paragraph and the list have gotten a border as well. Unfortunately, all of those borders have the same width, and the default width is often not quite what we need. Therefore, CSS also allows us to set that width using the border width property. The easiest way to set a value for that property is by using one of the keywords thick, medium, and thin. So let's try that and set different values for our elements. To do so, we first need separate selectors for the individual tags. When creating them, we will not remove the group selector, since we want all of the borders to be of the same kind. Instead, we will just add separate selectors for h1, p, and ul elements, and set border width for the property name inside them. The h1 elements will get thick as value, the p tags get medium, and the unordered list will have a thin border. This way, the borders of our elements should decrease in width from top to bottom, and we can see that when saving the files and refreshing the browser. Here, the heading now has the thickest border. The border for the paragraph is a bit thinner, and the list has a very fine border. As always when using keywords, the possibilities are very limited with them, and that's why we can also set the border width in pixels or any other unit that is supported by CSS. Let's try that and add another element to our HTML document, like a span tag for example. Now we need to add the span element to our group selector to make it have a solid border. Furthermore, we have to create an entry for the span tag to be able to adjust the value for the border width property. Let's set 25px for example to make it 25 pixels wide. Now we just need to save the document, refresh the site in the browser, and wow! It seems like we have gone way too far with our 25 pixels, but at least we can see that it has worked this way. Let's better reduce the width a bit anyway. I think 2 pixels should be enough. This now also looks much better in the browser. Furthermore, we can see that this border only reaches to the end of the text and not all the way over here to the end of the site. That's because the span tag is an inline element and only takes as much space as required. In addition to the width, we can also set the border's color, and we can do so using the border color property. This can take either the value transparent to make the border invisible, or a color in any format that CSS supports, with black being the default. Let's keep that for the h1 heading. For the p tag, we will add the border color property and make the border blue. The border for the list will be green, and the span tag gets a red border. If we now save it like that and refresh the site in the browser, the colorful borders will jump right at us. Now I have said that the border style property can be used to define a variety of different borders, and you are probably waiting to see which ones those are, since a solid border is not really spectacular. We can get a bit more of an interesting result by using the keyword dashed as value. Now it also pays off that we have kept the group selector for the border style property, since we only need to adjust one single line of CSS to be able to see the effect on borders with different width in the browser. We can also get dots instead of dashes for the border. To do so, we need to use the keyword dotted as value for the border style property. This will give us a dotted border in the browser. A bit more interesting is the value double. As the name suggests, it gives us a border consisting of two straight lines. Looking at the side, we should notice that the third border for the list is not displayed with two lines. That's because we have set thin for the border width here, and Chrome interprets this as a width of only 1 pixel. That leaves not enough space for more than one line. Even more spectacular is the effect we can get with the keyword groove. It is supposed to make the border run around the element as a groove. It is important to note that the effect adjusts to the border color. We can see that especially well when zooming in a bit and having a close-up look at the borders. The opposite of groove is the keyword ridge. It is supposed to make the border appear as if it was increased in height around the element. The effect of this value also depends on the border color. Just a little bit different is the effect of the inset keyword. It is not supposed to make the border appear increased, but instead make the content look as if it was further back than the border. It also changes with the border color. The opposite of inset is outset. It makes the element's content appear as if it was increased in height and therefore closer to the user. Here again, the effect depends on the color. The last valid value for the border style property is hidden. Just like the default value none, it makes the border disappear completely. The difference is how they behave when there is a conflict with another border definition, like those for table elements. If in such a case the value for the border style property is none, the other definition is more important and therefore the border is displayed anyway. If the border style is hidden, however, the border is not displayed in any case, no matter what the other definition says. So we now know how to set the kind, width and color of the border, but those settings are always applied to all four sides and therefore affect the entire border. But CSS also offers a way to set the values for each side individually by using the four words top, right, bottom and left. Those words are inserted into the property name between the border and the actual property. If we want to only set the style for the upper border, for example, we can change the border style property to the border top style property, save the file and return to the browser. And only the top border for the elements is visible anymore. We can use that behavior to set different styles for each side of the border. So let's add border right style with the value solid for the right side, border bottom style with dashed as value for the bottom side, and border left style with dotted as value for the left side in our CSS file. Save and return to the browser, and we can immediately see the four different styles in our borders. This does, of course, not only work with the border style, but with each one of the border properties we have learned so far. Therefore, we can adjust the p tag even more and set a border bottom color property to make the bottom color orange in addition to the general blue borders. Doing so, it is important to define the orange after the blue, because CSS is always interpreted in the order that it is written in. If the blue for all four sides came after the orange for the bottom side, all four sides would be painted blue and the orange would disappear. But this method bloats our CSS file quite a bit. We can potentially create one assignment per property and border side after all. Therefore, CSS allows us to shorten the code quite a bit by simply setting more than one value in the border style, border width and border color properties. If only one value is set, it applies to all four sides of the border, just like we have seen before. If we set two values instead, the first value is applied to the top and bottom border, while the second value is for the left and right side. Three values make the first one work for the top side, the second one for the left and right side, and the last value is for bottom. And if all four values are set, we start at the bottom and go around clockwise. Therefore, the order is then top, right, bottom, left. When adjusting all of those properties, we still need to add three assignments in our CSS file, one for border width, one for border style and one for border color. To keep the code as short as possible, there's a shorthand assignment for borders. To use that, we can simply use the border property instead of the individual properties. For the value, we need to define the width, style and color for the border in exactly this order. So let's remove all of this code and set the same border for all elements. To do so, we set border as property name. For the value, we first write the width, so 3px for example. Then we need to set the style, so let's choose dashed. And last but not least the color. Let's go with blue here. Now we only need to finish the assignment with a semicolon and save the file. And in the browser, all of our elements now have a border that is 3 pixels wide, dashed and blue. This, however, comes with the disadvantage that the assignment always applies to all 4 sides. To style each of these sides individually, we can use separate shorthand properties for the sides. Those are called border, followed by a dash, and then the name of the side, which can be top, right, bottom or left. So if we want to make the bottom border 5 pixels wide, green and solid, we can create an assignment for the border bottom property and set 5px solid green for the value. We again need to make sure that the assignment comes after the one for all 4 borders, to not have it painted over. Now we can save the file and refresh the site, and indeed, the bottom side is now just the way we wanted it to be. But the fun does not stop here, of course, since CSS allows us to round the corners of our border using the border radius property. For the value, this property accepts a number that defines how far from the corners the rounding should reach into the sides of the element. We can set that in any unit that CSS supports, so we can use percentages or pixels for example. Let's just use a percentage for our case by adding the border radius property to our entry in the CSS file, setting 15% for the value and finishing the assignment with a semicolon. Furthermore, we should define a uniform border for the entire element to better be able to see what is happening. So let's remove the border bottom property and change the style for the border to solid. Now we only need to save before we can return to the browser and have a look at the result. Here, the border now looks really interesting, but not exactly rounded. That's because we have set the radius as a percentage and our borders are much wider than high. Therefore, the rounding starts much sooner in the width than in the height, and that causes this strange effect. To solve that, we can set an absolute value like 5px instead of the 15% in our CSS file. Save again and refresh the site in the browser. That looks a lot better. Since the rounding is now the same in all directions, we now actually have neatly rounded corners. Of course, we can also make the rounding of the individual corners different degrees and therefore design very individual borders. As with the other border properties, there are individual property names for the individual corners. They are called border top left radius for top left, border top right radius for top right, border bottom right radius for bottom right, and border bottom left radius for bottom left. It is much easier, however, to keep the shorthand notation with the border radius property and simply specify more than one value. If only one value is given, it applies to all 4 corners. Here, all 4 corners are rounded to the same extent. If 2 values are given, they always apply to the opposite corners. The first value refers to the upper left and lower right corner, and the second value determines the rounding for the upper right and lower left corner. With 3 specified values, the first value applies to the upper left, the second to the upper right and lower left, and the third value for the lower right corner. And if all 4 values are given, it starts at the top left and goes around clockwise. The order is then top left, top right, and bottom left. Since each value stands for a corner and therefore defines how far the rounding should extend into the element along 2 sides of the border, we also have the option of defining a separate value for each of the 2 sides concerned. To do this, the 2 values for a corner are separated by a slash. The first value indicates how far the curvature should extend in the upper and lower side, and the second value determines the curvature of the left or right side. For example, if we enter 100px/5px for the value of the border radius property, save the file and switch back to the browser, then we see that the curvature on the horizontal axis extends quite far in the upper and lower side of the border. The right and left sides are hardly curved at all with their 5 pixels. Last but not least, with CSS we also have the option of defining images as border for our element. For this to work, it is first important to know that values for the border properties must also be set. As far as that is concerned, we are well prepared. After all, we have already created a border assignment for our elements. In order to be able to use a picture as border for our element, we first of all need a picture. So I composed this autumnal image in Photoshop, and it is perfect to use as a border in CSS, because CSS will cut it into 9 parts. Then the parts that are in the corners are used as corners for the border, and the parts between them act as the respective side of the border. We can decide whether they should be repeated or stretched to do so. We will see that in a moment. I saved the picture under the name border.png in the same folder as the CSS file. In order for the image to function as a border, we need to answer 2 questions. Which image should be used, and how big should the individual sections in our image be? We provide the answer for the first question with the help of the Border-image-source property. Similar to the background images, we can use a URL function as value and specify the path to the image within the brackets. Since my picture is called border.png and it is in the same folder as the CSS file, I can simply enter this name here. Now we have to tell CSS how big the individual parts are for our border in the image file. To do that, we will use the Border-image-slice property. In our case, all 9 regions in the image file are squares of the same size. They are exactly 300 by 300 pixels. This makes the assignment very easy, because then we only have to add the Border-image-slice property and specify 300 as value. It is not necessary to specify the unit, because the property only accepts pixels or percentages as value. If there is no percentage sign after the number, the browser knows that it is an indication in pixels. Unfortunately, not every image is divided that uniformly, and that is why the Border-image-slice property can also map very different and special divisions by specifying more than one value. If only one value is specified, a cut is made through the entire image at the specified distance from the top, bottom, left and right side of the image. This is how the individual regions for the border are created. If 2 values are given, the first value applies to the distance from the top and bottom edge, and the second value determines the distance for the cuts from the left and right edge. If 3 values are given, the first value applies to the distance from top, the second to the distances from left and right, and the third value defines the distance from the lower edge. And if all 4 values are given, you start at the top and go around clockwise, so they apply to the cuts top, right, bottom and left in that order. As we can see, there is always a region in the middle of the picture. This is not relevant for the border and is therefore abandoned by default. If we want to use it as a background for the element instead, we can do that by adding the keyword fill as value for the assignment for the Border-image-slice property. Now we provide the browser with all the necessary information. The Border-image-source property says where the image should be loaded from, and the Border-image-slice property determines the division of our image file. So we can now save the file, return to the browser and refresh the page, and the result looks really terrible. Nevertheless, one can at least guess what happened. These tiny orange dots are our pumpkins. Those elongated orange things are our orange leaves, and the yellow things are the yellow leaves. There are several reasons why it looks so bad. On the one hand, we specified 3 pixels for the width of the border in our CSS file, and that is why the pictures that make up our border are so tiny. So let's increase that value to 30 pixels for example, save the file and return to the browser, and at least it's a little easier to see what is happening. The main problem now is the orange leaves. These are drawn out incredibly long. This is because the width of our elements is larger than the 30 pixels we specified for the thickness of the border, and by default the border elements are stretched in such a case to reach the required size. But don't worry, that can of course be changed with the Border-image-repeat property. This property can have 4 different keywords as value. Stretch is the default case that always applies if no other value is specified. If we change the value to repeat instead, the individual border elements are enlarged or reduced so much that they correspond to the thickness of the border. In our case, they are scaled down to 30 pixels. They are then repeated until the entire length of the border sides is filled. However, no consideration is given to full visibility. If an element does not fit completely, it is simply cut off. This problem can be avoided with the keyword space. Here, the individual elements are only repeated as often as they actually fit into the length of the border sides without being cut off. If there is still space left in the border side, it is evenly distributed between the images. Unfortunately, this way you only adjust the height or the width of the border elements, depending on whether they are in the horizontal or vertical border side. This can lead to the aspect ratio of the individual pictures being totally distorted, and if the picture does not fit into the border side once, it is completely left out. That is why the yellow leaves for the left and right side cannot be seen at all. The fourth and final value is round, and that is by far the most sensible when using such images as we do. Here, the individual images are scaled, taking their aspect ratio into account, so that they fit into the specified width, and then repeated as often as possible without cutting off an image. If there is still space left, the individual images are adjusted in their width or height in order to fill the entire length of the border side. We can see that very well with the yellow leaf. In our paragraph, it had to be compressed a little to be visible at all, and in the heading it was stretched out in order to be able to fill the entire height. Now it could of course happen that our border should be 30 pixels wide, for example, but our pictures should only be half, so 15 pixels in size. To achieve this, we can use the border image width property, which can determine the size of individual border images regardless of the actual size of the border. So if we only want 15 pixel images, we add the border image width property and enter 15px value, save the file and refresh the page in the browser, and the images are actually only half as size as before. We can also see that the images are always placed on the outer edge of the actual border. Of course, we can also specify more than one value for this property in order to style the size of the four sides differently. As always, you start at the top and go around clockwise. Of course, you can also do the opposite of what we have done and make the images larger than the actual border in this way. In our case, for example, set 45 pixels for the size. In the browser, this means that the images extend into our text, as they are still placed on the outer edge of our 30 pixels wide border. The excess 15 pixels per side are applied towards the inside. To change that, we can use the Border-image-outset property. This lets us specify how far the border images can extend beyond the edge of the actual border. And of course, we can specify 1 to 4 values here again, in order to define it either the same for all sides or individually for the individual sides. Since each of our border images extends 15 pixels into the actual content due to our border image width property, in our case it is enough to specify only one value for the border image outset property, 15 pixels. This should ensure that our border images are allowed to extend 15 pixels over the outer edge of the actual border and so no longer reach into the content. We can also see this in the browser, where our content is no longer mixed with the actual border images. Since the images now extend beyond the actual border of the element, it can happen in this way that the border images of one element overlap the border of another element, or even its content. Therefore, this feature should only be used with great caution. Since we are now again using 5 properties to define the border images, there's also a shorthand for border images that combines all of the border image properties. The property for this is simply called border image. So if we want to shorten our properties for the border image, we can use this border image property. As value, we need the values for the border image source, so the source of the image with our URL function, followed by border image slice, so the division of the image with 300, the border image width, the border image outset, and finally border image repeat. Should we not need a value here, as it is often the case with border image width and border image outset, we can safely omit these. As long as the other values are in the correct order, it will work. Finally, we should say a word about the accessibility of our site, because technologies to support people with limited abilities, such as the blind, usually do not evaluate border images. Therefore, information that is important for understanding the site should never be stored in the border of an element, but always be described with words in the document. That was a lot of information again, but if you have made it this far, it was worth it. You now know all the possibilities that CSS offers us to define and manipulate the borders of our elements. If you have any questions on the topic, feel free to write them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them. If you liked the video, I would be very happy if you leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and come back again for the next video.